I observe something unfolding in American financial institutions that transcends the daily political theater surrounding individual actors and strikes directly at the foundational trust mechanisms that have enabled patient capital to compound safely in this jurisdiction for over 2 centuries. The Deutsche Bank documents that surfaced this week represent more than a scandal involving inflated asset valuations. They represent a systematic stress test of whether financial institutions can maintain their credibility when confronted with evidence of decade-long misrepresentation by politically connected borrowers who operated outside traditional accountability frameworks. What concerns me most profoundly as someone who has allocated capital across 7 decades of market cycles is not the fate of any individual business empire, but the precedent being established for how our banking system prices risk when borrowers systematically misrepresent collateral values to multiple institutions simultaneously. The evidence emerging from federal investigations reveals a pattern of financial conduct that, if left unaddressed, fundamentally undermines the trust premium that American financial institutions have commanded in international capital markets since the establishment of modern banking regulation. The Deutsche Bank revelations document something far more significant than aggressive accounting or creative financial engineering. When borrowers claim properties are worth $291 million to secure loans, while simultaneously valuing those same assets at $30 million for tax purposes, we are witnessing systematic fraud that destroys the informational foundation upon which complex financial systems depend for accurate risk assessment and capital allocation. This represents not isolated misconduct, but institutional failure to maintain the verification standards that separate legitimate banking from speculative lending based on demonstrably false representations. I have spent my career studying how trust compounds in financial systems and how quickly that trust evaporates when fundamental assumptions about borrower honesty prove incorrect. The mathematics are unforgiving. When major financial institutions discover they have extended hundreds of millions in credit based on asset valuations that were inflated by factors of 3 to 10 times actual worth, the systematic repricing of risk affects not just the institutions directly involved, but the entire ecosystem of lenders who must now account for the possibility that other politically connected borrowers may have engaged in similar misrepresentation. The admission posted on social media platforms acknowledging that banks were stupid enough to lend based on my valuations represents perhaps the most damaging legal confession I have witnessed in 7 decades of following white-collar prosecutions. This statement contains explicit acknowledgement of every element prosecutors require to prove bank fraud: false statements to financial institutions, knowledge that those statements were false, intent to obtain loans based on those statements, and confirmation that banks relied on the misrepresentations when making lending decisions. But the implications extend far beyond individual criminal liability toward fundamental questions about how international capital evaluates the reliability of American financial institutions and the regulatory frameworks designed to prevent systematic fraud. When borrowers can obtain billions in credit from major international banks based on demonstrably false financial statements spanning multiple decades, foreign investors must necessarily increase their risk premiums for assets located in jurisdictions where such conduct appears to have been tolerated by regulatory oversight mechanisms. The relationship between Deutsche Bank and politically connected American borrowers reveals institutional vulnerabilities that compound over time when commercial banks prioritize high-profile client relationships over fundamental due diligence requirements. After American banks refused additional lending based on previous defaults and casino bankruptcies, Deutsche Bank continued extending credit totaling over $2 billion, even after experiencing defaults on previous loans from the same borrower. This pattern suggests either catastrophic failure of risk assessment procedures or deliberate disregard for standard banking practices when dealing with politically sensitive accounts. The systematic nature of these misrepresentations, affecting dozens of properties across multiple decades with consistent patterns of inflation for lending purposes and deflation for tax purposes, demonstrates conscious intent rather than inadvertent errors in valuation methodology. When borrowers' own accounting firms withdraw certification from financial statements citing unreliable numbers, the fraud becomes documented not just through external investigation, but through internal professional acknowledgement that the representations cannot be supported by legitimate accounting standards. I calculate the long-term implications of this institutional failure through multiple analytical frameworks that extend well beyond immediate legal consequences toward fundamental questions about financial system integrity. International capital markets operate on the assumption that major banks perform adequate due diligence before extending large credit facilities, and that regulatory oversight prevents systematic misrepresentation from continuing across multiple years without detection and consequences. When those assumptions prove incorrect, as the Deutsche Bank documents clearly demonstrate, international investors must systematically reprieve their exposure to American financial institutions and the regulatory framework that failed to prevent or detect such extensive fraud. This repricing happens gradually and often invisibly, but its cumulative effect on borrowing costs, credit availability, and investment flows becomes measurable over extended time horizons as foreign capital becomes more cautious about American institutional reliability. The Senate Banking Committee's emergency hearings and subpoenas for Deutsche Bank executives represent institutional attempts to understand how such systematic fraud could continue for decades without triggering internal bank controls or regulatory intervention. The questions being asked: how did the bank approve loans with such inflated valuations, whether employees raised concerns that were ignored, and whether unusual arrangements or incentives influenced lending decisions, strike at fundamental assumptions about banking integrity that underpin international confidence in American financial institutions. The intersection of financial fraud with national security concerns compounds these institutional risks exponentially. When borrowers with hundreds of millions in debt to entities connected to foreign governments serve in executive positions with authority over foreign policy, sanctions, and international agreements, the potential for conflicts of interest extends beyond traditional financial crime toward questions about whether policy decisions were influenced by creditor relationships that were established through fraudulent misrepresentations. The investigative focus on whether Russian oligarchs and Middle Eastern investors backed portions of the Deutsche Bank lending creates additional layers of institutional concern that foreign intelligence services may have gained leverage over American political leadership through financial relationships built on systematically false asset valuations. This possibility requires fundamental reassessment of how financial fraud affects national security when politically connected individuals accumulate foreign debt through misrepresentation while maintaining access to classified information and policy-making authority. I observe how quickly institutional confidence can deteriorate when fundamental assumptions about borrower honesty and regulatory effectiveness prove incorrect. The response from Republican political leadership, distancing statements from figures like Mitch McConnell, who rarely break with politically allied actors, suggests recognition that defending systematic financial fraud carries political costs that extend beyond partisan loyalty toward basic questions about institutional integrity and rule of law consistency. The polling data showing that significant percentages of Republican voters believe investigation is warranted demonstrates that financial fraud transcends political affiliation when the evidence becomes overwhelming and the conduct affects basic assumptions about fair dealing in commercial relationships. When voters across political divides recognize that systematic misrepresentation to financial institutions undermines economic stability, the political protection traditionally afforded to powerful actors begins to erode rapidly. The prosecutorial response from the Southern District of New York, opening criminal investigations within hours of the social media admission, follows predictable patterns in major white-collar cases where defendants publicly acknowledge conduct that constitutes federal crimes. Bank fraud carries penalties of up to 30 years imprisonment and fines up to $1 million per violation, creating powerful incentives for cooperation among witnesses who may have participated in or observed the systematic misrepresentation documented in the Deutsche Bank records. The strategic implications for future electoral cycles compound the immediate legal jeopardy because candidates facing federal fraud charges cannot effectively compete for swing voters who prioritize honesty, competence, and stability in governance. While core supporters may dismiss financial fraud as normal business practice, Independent voters who determine general election outcomes typically reject candidates whose business practices involved systematic deception of financial institutions and tax authorities. The fundamental question underlying these developments transcends individual accountability toward whether American institutions can maintain international confidence when systematic fraud by politically connected actors goes unaddressed, despite overwhelming documentary evidence and public admissions of wrongdoing. Equal justice under law requires that financial crimes receive consistent prosecution regardless of the defendant's wealth, political connections, or media profile. If systematic bank fraud documented across multiple decades with clear evidence and explicit admissions fails to result in meaningful legal consequences, international capital must conclude that American institutions apply different standards to politically powerful actors than to ordinary borrowers who would face immediate prosecution for identical conduct. This two-tier system would fundamentally undermine the institutional premium that American assets have commanded based on reliable legal enforcement and regulatory consistency. The compound effect of institutional failure extends beyond immediate market reactions toward long-term structural changes in how international capital evaluates American regulatory reliability and legal consistency. When major financial institutions can extend billions in credit based on systematically false representations without facing meaningful regulatory consequences, and when borrowers can publicly admit to bank fraud without immediate legal action, the precedent establishes that sufficient political influence can effectively override traditional legal and regulatory constraints. This erosion of institutional reliability increases systematic risk premiums across the entire American financial system, as international investors must account for the possibility that other politically connected actors may have engaged in similar misrepresentation without detection or consequences. The cost of this increased risk assessment compounds over time through higher borrowing costs, reduced foreign investment, and gradual capital flight toward jurisdictions where legal enforcement appears more consistent and predictable. Markets reward institutional reliability and punish systematic uncertainty with mathematical precision. The resolution of these Deutsche Bank revelations will establish precedents affecting how international capital evaluates American institutional durability for decades. I position for institutional accountability while remaining aware that systems tolerating systematic fraud by powerful actors experience accelerating institutional decay that ultimately affects all participants, regardless of their individual conduct or political affiliations.